Today we're going to be discussing psychodynamic theory, which comes to us from Freud, and this is technically the first theory that developed in the counseling field. So first of all, let's go ahead and work on our group discussions here. So get into your small groups, and I would encourage you to discuss the following probe. So to what extent do you believe that mental health, substance use, and relationship problems have childhood beginnings? I'm going to take out a piece of paper and reflect on your answer for 10 minutes. Discuss your answer with your partners for another 10 minutes, and then decide what you'd like to share with the group about your conversation. So again, just to return to the brief overview of the schools of psychotherapy that we're going to be covering this semester. Like I said earlier, psychodynamic and Adlerian theory were really the first to develop historically. And we'll be discussing those today. The next ones that will be coming up will obviously be the cognitive behavioral, followed by the existential humanistic, and then lastly the constructivist and feminist. So what is it that we're talking about when we discuss psychodynamic theory? Well, as you can see from this diagram, psychodynamic theories have taken shape in different ways over time. However, they all draw their origins from psychoanalysis, which was the first talking cure for mental health symptoms. Today we're going to be discussing Carl Jung and Freudian theories, and then move on to Adler next week. Although they're fairly different approaches, they basically all hold the same basic components. Those basic components are, first of all, an emphasis on the centrality of intrapsychic and unconscious conflicts and how those relate to development. These theorists also identify defenses as developing in the psychic structures as a way of avoiding unpleasant consequences of conflict either within the self or with other people. And thirdly, a belief that psychopathology develops especially from early childhood experiences. So those are the three things that are shared by the psychodynamic theorists, even though they have considerable variation within this broader umbrella. So the two big theorists we're going to be discussing today are Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. You read a really nice biography in the text about Freud's life, so I won't go into too many details. In general, he's remembered for creating psychoanalysis. However, he claimed that he discovered the unconscious, and that's what he said was his great crowning achievement. However, I think it would be inaccurate to say Freud discovered the unconscious, as he was heavily influenced by Charot and Breuer's hypnotic techniques, which already seemed to sort of tap into the unconscious. However, what Freud really did was he used his talking cure as a way to tap into the unconscious even more than the hypnotic theories had tried to do through the techniques of free association and dream interpretation. His theory is largely based on the idea that sex is the main driver of human behavior. And although he did a lot more than that, including developing our ideas of defense mechanisms, he's still nonetheless remembered as the dirty old man of psychology. For those of you guys who haven't had a chance to read Freud in the original, he's quite a light, pithy, fun read, so I would encourage you all to pick him up sometime. Our next theorist is Carl Jung. Carl Jung was an early adherent of Freud, but eventually he split ways over a disagreement regarding the structure of the personality and Freud's emphasis on sexuality. He was a Swiss theorist, Swiss psychoanalyst, and originally he was supposed to be a minister, but instead chose to study medicine. He was very interested in human meaning and particularly in spirituality issues throughout his career. His first achievement really that was original was to differentiate between two classes of people according to attitude types. You have on the one hand the extroverts, those are the sort of outward looking, and then you have introverted people who are more inward looking. Later, Jung went on to differentiate between the four functions of the mind: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, one or more of which predominate in any given person. So, as we went over last week, we're going to be exploring our theories using the transcultural model, which of course identified the 4 common factors which account for why a person might benefit from a therapeutic treatment. Those 4 common factors, again, are myth, ritual, relationship, and expectancy. And for each of these features, we're going to look at what psychoanalysis and psychodynamic theory says about them. It'll be a little bit different for Freud and Jung, but hopefully we'll be able to cover them adequately. So the first, we'll start off with myth. The myth explains why problems or symptoms are occurring. Well, in psychodynamic theory, one big part of the myth is that pathology is the result of childhood relationship issues, and that our difficulty in adult life stems from these thwarted experiences as children. And that really, particularly the attachment relationships we have with our caregivers, influence our overall functioning as adults. They sort of create these templates and these scripts that we use that repeat in our adult relationships. Although this was sort of bold, broad, hypothetical belief, this has more or less been supported by attachment theory, which actually has some empirical evidence to support it. Another part of this myth, particularly for Freud, is that people are often not consciously aware of why they behave in a certain way. So you might be doing something over and over and over again, and you have no idea why. That is really what the work of psychoanalysis does, is to sort of understand why it is that people are behaving a certain way. And that they would also argue that these past relationships can play out in the current relationships. So if you had conflict with your mother or difficulty with your father, that will sort of show up in your adult relationships, pretty much no matter what you do. Jung had a slightly different myth. He believed that pathology was really due to the limitations that are placed upon us by the symbolic roles we have, which are ultimately determined by our culture. For example, we maybe have the archetype for the Earth Mother, and we feel the social pressure to be the Earth Mother, but we also feel this competing pressure to be either the hero or the snake. And an issue and conflict between these archetypes, or not acknowledging these archetypes, is what creates interpersonal issues, as well as personality differences. So, one of the ones using Jung's functions would be to say that people who in the Myers-Briggs are T's and P's often maybe struggle in romantic relationships because they have different ways of processing the world. So, like I said, a lot of the initial insights into the importance of childhood relationships has been more or less confirmed by attachment theory. And I would really say that attachment theory is one of the major forces in psychodynamic theory as it's practiced today. Attachment theory suggests that when people are babies and they experience good enough mothering, they form what's called a secure attachment with that parent or that caregiver. Basically, when they say good enough mothering, that means that when the infant is small and very needy and very vulnerable, the mother is receptive and responsive to the infant's needs. When the infant cries, the mother comes to it. When the infant is hungry, the mother feeds it. Initially this is very consistent and reliable. So the infant really starts to expect that, okay, the mother will be there. And then as that infant gets into sort of later childhood, that mothering might not always be 100% consistent, but there is enough, more or less, I guess you could say, money in the bank for that child to anticipate that their needs will eventually be met by that parent, that she's trustworthy and that good things will return even if they're not always there. So in that situation where there is that secure attachment and there has been good enough mothering, the child can tolerate a bit more disappointment in the world and what they experience from the mother, and that allows the child, as they get older, to start to explore the world and to leave the mother's side and to go out and check things out and perhaps come across something that's anxiety invoking are something that is fearful, and the child knows that they can always return back to the secure base of the parent to ease that anxiety, that there's a way that, coming back to the parent, coming back to the attachment object is a way of sort of soothing the child, and that helps the child feel capable of going out and exploring the world. However, when there's not that secure base, because maybe there hasn't been good enough mothering, or mother was depressed when the baby was born, and so she wasn't always able to respond adequately to his or her cries, that child sort of develops anxiety around whether or not the mother is going to respond to their needs. And rather than having a expectation that people can be reliable and that good things will arrive, an alternative script is kind of created in the mind and in the world of this child, that good things can sometimes be pulled away, or that you can't necessarily count on people to stay. So when facing anxiety-provoking situations, the child with this anxious attachment doesn't necessarily seek relief from the anxiety in the secure base of the parent. They might, get more anxious being around the parent, or they might seek the parent and feel angry at the parent. So that's what happens necessarily with insecure attachment. And attachment theorists would argue really that these either secure or insecure attachments in childhood can lead to difficulty in adult relationships. And that has been extended to include relationships throughout the lifetime. So why are early childhood relationships so vital to adult relationships? It's worth wondering about, right? Well, Freud argued that we have a repetition compulsion that suggests that we seek out familiar situations. So how many of you guys out there have had friends who tend to date the exact same type of person, only to be surprised when once again it doesn't work out? Anyone? Yeah, it's not that uncommon, and Freud would say it was almost inevitable. And part of the myth of psychodynamic theory is that people will unconsciously seek out dysfunctional adult relationships in a hope of resolving what was sort of unresolved in childhood. So what this means is that they will find themselves back in that same place over again in hopes that they will somehow be able to get a different outcome than they had gotten before. More contemporary theorists have really extended this to suggest that clients, when we're working with them in counseling, will behave in ways that really engender particular responses from others that conform with their previous experiences in interpersonal relationships. So clients will maybe elicit from you what they expect from others, perhaps lack of empathy, abandonment, frustration, and that's kind of what they do and try to pull from you. And this is something that isn't totally foreign to other areas of psychology. The Zeigarnik effect is something that pops up in social psychology literature, which says that people tend to remember uncompleted or interrupted tasks better than completed tasks. So if you were unable to successfully negotiate a relationship with your mother, you will keep remembering that relationship and seek it out. So that is basically why those early childhood relationships end up influencing adult relationships. The issue with this, of course, is that if you do what you've always done, the psychodynamic theorists would argue that you always get what you've always gotten. In other words, you may attempt to resolve your issues through a new relationship, but you'll find out eventually that you're in the very same place that you were before. So here's a case example. I want you to think for yourself about what might emerge in adulthood. So we have a family structure here. There's a mother, a father, and two brothers. Your client is the oldest brother. The father is physically abusive. The mother is withdrawn. The father is authoritarian and berates any rule breaking in the family. He can become violent. The mother does not defend the children when this happens and is herself beaten at times by the father. When the father's abusive to the younger brother or mother, the older brother steps in and sacrifices him to keep the peace. So, what might you find in adulthood? Well, one thing that you might find is someone that is someone who is conflict averse, someone who is very uncomfortable when people they love are angry at them, are fighting at them. Might also be somebody who is a peacemaker, or somebody who is always trying to negotiate things so that tensions don't run too high. And you can sort of see where that came from, right? That this was the relationship pattern, this was a role that this client took on when they were a child and has played out as an adult. Of course, part of this is that much of this goes on without our awareness. And Freud argued that these processes, particularly the repetition compulsion, is unconscious, and they happen without our knowing them. And for Freud and a lot of the psychodynamic theorists, most of what is in our mind is actually in the unconscious. Freud used the iceberg metaphor to describe this phenomenon. So what you see above the surface is relatively small in comparison to what is unseen. So the unconscious level is really where there's a whole lot more stuff in our minds. But even though when you look at the iceberg, you just sort of see what's above the surface. Freud also posits this subconscious or the preconscious level, which is also sort of beneath the surface, but it's not that far, which holds memories and stored knowledge which aren't necessarily immediately in our awareness, but we could recall them with some effort. So, at the very top, what's above the surface, our normal thoughts, our normal perceptions, our kind of memories that we can recall without any effort. Then there's the layer of the preconscious, which has some stored knowledge, some stored memories, things that are a little hard to remember, maybe our first grade teacher's name. That's one I tried to come up with the other day and took a while. And then lastly, the biggest part of the mind, of our psyche, is the unconscious part. And these are sort of the things that we have no awareness of, our urges, our irrational wishes, our sexual desires, the fears we have, memories that we just couldn't remember even if we wanted to. And this notion of the unconscious and the relationship between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind plays into the structure of how Freud saw our personalities. So this is another part of the myth. He thought that individuals had a three-part structure to their personality. The first was the id. The id is, of course, more or less the unconscious, which is governed by pleasure and seeks immediate gratification. That's, the sort of part that wants to eat anything, wants to have sex, wants to kill, has all of these kind of impulses that are scary and threatening. Then the ego, which is concerned with making rational decisions. This is also the reality principle, the id being the pleasure principle. And then finally there's the superego, which is the sort of internalized parent voice, which makes moral judgments. So this is, internalized parent can be God, or can be the actual parent. And so what Freud really thought happened with people was that this ego, this kind of rational center, was pulled back and forth by the id and by the superego. And this tension really gives way to personality conflicts. So when the ego is overwhelmed by the id, we become neurotic. And when the ego gives into it, the superego punishes the ego with guilt. And the ego really tries to cope with these conflicting demands through neuroses and through dreams, which is a way of fulfilling the id's suppressed desires. It can also deal with these conflicting demands using defense mechanisms, which reduce anxiety. Freud argued that ultimately, though, these defense mechanisms, though they're useful, can become pathogenic and can be a cause of mental illness. Which brings us to the topic of defense mechanisms. Like we said on the last slide, defense mechanisms crop up to reduce the ego's anxiety from the threatening, dangerous desires of the id. Defenses may hide any variety of thoughts or feelings, things like anger, fear, sadness, depression, competitiveness, admiration, dependency, grandiosity, and helplessness. And to kind of protect the ego, or to reduce the anxiety the ego experiences when these feelings start to crop up, people go for these defense mechanisms. And some of the top 10 ones we'll be discussing would be repression. That's one. And with repression, you push a thought or memory away from your awareness. You might say something like, that never happened. Another one is denial, where you completely reject thought or the feeling. You might say, I'm not angry with that person. Suppression, you're vaguely aware of the thought or the feeling, but you try to hide it. For instance, you say, I'm going to try to be nice to him. Another one is reaction formation. So you turn the feeling into its opposite, where you would say, oh, no, I think he's a really great person. Projection, you think someone else has your thought or your feeling. That professor hates me. That student hates him. Really, you hate that professor. Displacement, this is where you redirect your feelings onto another target, where you say, I hate that secretary, when really you're feeling angry at your professor. Rationalization is another one. Come up with various explanations to justify the situation while denying your feelings. He's so critical because he's trying to help us do our best, might be one that you could rationalize. Intellectualization is another one that's very common. And this type, it's a type of rationalization, only it's only more intellectualized. So an example would be saying, Nietzsche said that anger is an ontological despair, which you think, what in the world does that mean? So just take a minute here. I wonder, which of these defense mechanisms would you say you used most? And how does it help you cope? How does it potentially interfere with what you've got going on in your life? So for here, we're going to work with our partners or independently to identify the defense mechanisms in the script that I have posted. You're welcome to use the handout I've used, but I'd like for you to see if you can identify them when they're in regular conversation. All right, so now we're coming back and we're going to talk a little bit about Jung's myth. He has quite a different picture of one's personality than Freud had. Of course, Freud had the id, the ego, and the superego. And, Jung, like Freud, emphasized that the unconscious was really important in the development of personality. However, he had a pretty divergent understanding of the personality structure itself. He was really interested in this idea of the collective unconscious and the archetypes that emerge from it. And that really led him to argue that there were sort of four archetypes. When we say archetypes, he would sometimes call them psychic organs. So if you were to think about the psychic organs, they're not unlike physical organs, except you can't see them. So if you were to think of the brain as being an organ, well, the persona might be the brain stem, and the animus might be the prefrontal cortex, and the shadow side might be the amygdala, and the self might be the corpus callosum, something like that. So thinking about it in that way. So what did Jung mean by all of these terms? Well, the persona is the public image or the mask that we present to the world that is rooted really in our social roles. So my persona for you right now is a professor speaking to you in front of this room. I'm acting a certain way. your persona would be, at least right now, that of a student. The anima, or animus, represents the unconscious other sex side of a man or a woman's personality. So men have anima and women have animus, which is to sort of say that my feminine persona is balanced out by an unconscious male part of myself, which has all of the other masculine qualities that come together to make a whole. And then there's the shadow. So the shadow is the unconscious parts of the self that are rejected or ignored by the ego. So if the shadow is repressed, individuals may be inhibited or feel fearful. So the goal of therapy in those cases would really to bring the client in touch with their shadow side. So what might be in your shadow side? Well, I sometimes like to make jokes that, my shadow side likes boxing and, rap music, which is not untrue. But I guess it's not really my shadow if I'm owning it. But things that, are somewhat inconsistent with the rest of my personality. You might be able to think about what your shadow side might entail for you. And then lastly, the self. So the self is the regulating center of one's personality that brings together the conscious and the unconscious processes. So this is sort of, if you were to think about the personality as being a Venn diagram, the self would be the kind of place where the unconscious and the conscious parts, circles, meet. Another contribution to Jung's mythology was this idea of personality types. He was really one of the first to think about people as having consistent traits across individuals. And he came with this idea by really observing himself and his patients, and he identified some dimensions of the personality that were later referred to as personality types. Each of these dimensions have conscious and unconscious processes. The first that he discovered were the attitudes. So the attitudes are the orientations to the world. Extroverts are more concerned with their external world, whereas introverts are more concerned with their own thoughts and ideas. So, everyone know if they were an introvert or an extrovert? Well, you'll find out at some point soon. Jung didn't think that these were hard and fast, and that if you're one, that you don't have anything of the other. He argued that they're sort of polarities, but that ultimately people have both qualities that they use at different points in their lives. So, for instance, when I was a reporter, I had to be much more of an extrovert, than I did when I was a counselor or when I was in graduate school writing my dissertation. Now that I'm a professor again, I'm definitely more concerned with the external world. So, these things shift and change based on the circumstances you find yourself in. But Jung eventually thought that the attitudes were too simplistic, so he included something that he called the functions. And he argued that we had a rational function and an irrational function. The rational function was either thinking or feeling, and this required how people make judgments. So he said that when people employ thinking, they use their intellectual functioning to connect and understand the world. When they use their feeling function, they make decisions on the basis of having positive or negative feelings or values. So, do you make decisions based on your thinking or your feeling? And then the irrational function. So this is either sensation and intuition, which relates to perceptions of stimuli, not necessarily to evaluation or decision making. So he argues that there's sort of a polarity of sensing and intuition. So on the one hand, sensing is using your senses like hearing, touching, smelling, versus intuition, which is picking up on big picture things or patterns that are hunches or vague and unclear. So those would be the functions that he developed. And these are obviously the basis of the Myers-Briggs Personality Inventory, the MBTI, which you'll probably learn about in your evaluation and assessment class. part of Jung's myth, obviously, is the idea of the archetype. We mentioned that earlier in his personality structure when we talked about the persona, the anima, the shadow, and the self. And he really thought that archetypes were these innate, universal prototypes for our ideas and our experiences, and they could be used to interpret our world. He thought that they were not necessarily unique to the individual, but that they were, believe it or not, shared by all people through what he called the collective unconscious. So, I have things that I don't remember, and then we all have things that we all don't remember that are part of the collective unconscious, that it's sort of built into our DNA, more or less. And what helped him decide on this, or come to this conclusion, was that as he traveled around the world and looked at different religions, he noticed that there was a sameness or similarity to our experiences. And he thought that, that was pretty curious, that whether you were in 5th century India or, the 14th century in, France, there were similarities to the stories and the things that we would look at. And what he noticed was that, we would have these stories that would, fall into these categories, like the story of the hero, the story of the child, the old wise man, the earth mother, the demon, the god, the snake. And that if we were to really understand how these play out, we would need to look at the symbols and imagery that emerges in a person's story, a person's experience. So you would sort of look at people's dream life. You would look at symbols that emerge at other parts of their world to help identify what archetypes are at play by examining the sort of symbols that emerge in someone's world. And really the goal of therapy for Jungian is to become more aware of the archetypes through examining the symbols that emerge. And that, the unconscious conflict between your earth mother and your hero or your snake is causing challenges in your life, and starting to parse those things out and recognize the different parts of you that exist through these archetypes is key to what he would call wholeness, calling wellness. So now that we've talked about myths, now we're going to move on to the rituals, the next part. So one of the big rituals of psychodynamic theory is, of course, connecting the past to the present. And this will ultimately be your recording assignment for psychodynamic therapy. I'd like for you to work with your groups, identify someone as either the counselor, or someone can be the co-counselors, and then someone is the designated client. And I would like for you just to start counseling them to discuss a current relational problem. And, it can be a relational problem with a friend, a partner, or a supervisor. I would encourage you to use real content because it will make it easier for your counselor to tune into your affect, which is obviously a part of this assignment. However, that's not required. There's no expectation that you'll share your deepest, most pressing relational problem. So what I would like to see is for you to explore a current relational problem and notice when affect arises in that person's description, that you will be able to ask them, when in your life did you first experience this? And this will hopefully help your client to connect the relationship that happened in the past to one they're experiencing now. This is a sort of typical ritual in psychodynamic therapy. I would ask for you to maybe record for about 10 minutes, just to make sure that you have some stuff to discuss. Another ritual that's very common in psychodynamic theory is working through transference. So, anyone know what transference is? Well, transference is basically the idea that the client comes to therapy with some relational templates, and then you, as a therapist, are fit into one of those patterns somehow, which may or may not have a whole lot to do with you, and likely will have a whole lot to do with your client. I think in general, before we talk about this, clients get a little nervous about a client's transference. But the important thing to remember is that it mostly has very little to do with you. The exception would be the intersubjectivity or the two-person relational therapists who would take issue with that. The important thing to remember really is that when it shows up, it's a good thing because it really sets the stage for the therapy offering a corrective emotional experience for the client if you're able to adequately work your way through it. So here's an example from clinical practice. You notice that your client makes frequent attempts to care for you, such as checking in every week about how things are going, maybe paying the above agreed upon rate for therapy, bringing gifts when they're out of town, giving unsolicited advice. And rather than becoming annoyed with a client and ignoring this behavior, your rabbit ears should be listening. When you talk to your client about this, the client seems very aware and surprised, very unaware and surprised. They do admit that that being taken care of by you is very difficult for them. Of course, you can see conversation about the conversation about the relationship, and the conversation about the conversation is one example of how therapy is pretty different than your conversations with normal friends and family. In a subsequent session, you learn through your interviews about childhood history and current relationships that the client has a history of relationships wherein she takes care of others. That history has its roots in childhood. She was responsible for caring for her sick father at the expense of her own wants and needs. In adulthood, she feels dissatisfied with caring for others at the expense of her own needs and comes to resent her parents, resent her partners. My bad. So in terms of working through the transference, the treatment focus would then be on helping the client to become aware of when they're making attempts to take care of the therapist, to be more comfortable in the help-seeking role, and then to take the lead in discussions and ask questions to the therapist. Things as basic as that really can lead to sort of a shift in dynamic. And this will ultimately help the client develop an internal working model for what an egalitarian relationship looks like. And the client, with enough time, hopefully will be able to generalize this relational template of an egalitarian relationship to their future dating relationships. So, your work is about not only bringing on insight, but also helping that client change what they're doing. And they're able to have insight and change in the therapy relationship. And they can practice that and get a good feel for it. And then eventually the hope is that they will take that show on the road. Another ritual that's very common in psychodynamic therapy is working through ego defense mechanisms. Obviously, noticing when clients are giving you defense mechanisms. Here you can see that this analyst is aware that jokes are often a way of avoiding potentially unconscious and threatening material. And he will hopefully call that client out on it and will wonder about what's being avoided. So noticing the defense mechanisms, calling them out, not sort of necessarily giving into them, and wondering about what's behind them. Another ritual of psychodynamic therapy is the dream analysis. So this is one way of making the thought unknown conscious. In dream analysis, we are able to uncover unconscious wants, desires, and emotions. And dreams are often the brain's way of processing things that are happening in their lives. We read in the chapter that there are objective and subjective ways of interpreting dreams, and that sometimes the emotions that are attached to those dreams are just as important as the content of the dreams, that what the client is feeling in the dream or is thinking about the dream is just as important as the content. So in class, we will ask if anyone has a dream that they'd like to share. Maybe we can interpret it. Another way of making the thought unknown conscious is through free association. So free association is a way of revealing unconscious content. Clients will often recline on a couch rather than sit in a chair, as this is more likely to produce free-flowing associations. Analysts look for disruptions in associations that might indicate that the content is anxiety-inducing. So if the client is free associating and then makes a joke, you're probably getting close to stuff that's anxiety-inducing. If the patient or client struggles with free association, the analyst will interpret this as well, and if it makes sense, we'll share that interpretation with the patient. You can say here, funny, I suddenly have nothing on my mind. You might kind of wonder, like, oh, what kind of resistance is coming up here? What are they trying to avoid? Again, a lot of what we know about old school psychoanalysis, things like the psychosocial stages of development, the oral, anal, phallic, latency, genital stages, the idea of lying on a couch, the drive theory of the pleasure principle and the death theory, as well as things like Oedipus complex. They've kind of lost favor. That doesn't really, even psychoanalysis that happens right now tends to be much more nuanced and be infused with, at least I would think, attachment theory. However, that model, that 4 times a week for 3 years, is still something that happens. You can find it certainly in bigger cities, but it is ultimately a very expensive, time-consuming process that is just not really reasonable for most clients. However, that does not mean that psychodynamic therapy has fallen out of favor. The old school psychoanalysis has really been replaced with shorter versions of psychodynamic therapy, which makes use of emotional responses that are in session, processing what a client is feeling in the moment, being present, rather than just kind of gaining insight. And ultimately, in these new models of psychodynamic therapy, having these intense emotional reactions in session can help a client really gain access to conscious material, and it can kind of speed things up. That they're able to connect with the unconscious and emotional sensations rather than just getting thwarted into the ego defense mechanisms that might happen if you're free associating or using your dreams. A great example of this is, of course, the accelerated experiential dynamic psychotherapy with Diane Fosha, which is probably what we're going to watch in a little while. And in this therapy, the therapist works to facilitate a patient-therapist relationship that's characterized by sort of secure attachment. The relationship becomes the secure base from which fear, shame, and distress can be dyadically regulated. So the therapist provides this holding environment for the client to experience all of these really intense emotions like fear, shame, distress. And the therapist can be supportive and help in the processing of these emotions to their completion. Lastly, we're going to look at, well, I guess not lastly, we still have expectation, but the relationship. So in traditional psychodynamic therapy, The relationship is marked by one in which the counselor or the analyst is the expert. So the counselor might be the blank screen for the client to project their feelings onto, and they work through that transference. In this case, the therapist is intentionally quiet and intentionally pretty opaque, so the client is able to just make sense of them through their transference, and that can heighten it and speed things up. In this model, however, the client really relies on the therapist for any kind of new insights that occur. If your therapist is great and brilliant in interpreting, then you'll do well. But if your therapist is not so great and their interpretations aren't fantastic, it might not be that helpful. However, in the new attachment relationship, two-person psychology, relational psychodynamic therapy, that healing occurs through a new attachment with that therapist. So the counselor's attunement and engagement creates that secure holding environment, and the client's able to experience good enough caregivers. And that also allows the clients to experience and cope with their own dysregulated emotions, because there's someone who's big and strong and powerful to sort of help them through that. And clients are ultimately transformed not because of the insight, but because they experience something new that's outside of their well-worn relational dynamic. A client comes in and expects all men to be rejecting or disapproving, and a client ends up having this strong relationship with a male therapist where that person is not rejecting and that person is supportive and that person is able to be there for them. Ultimately, that can be corrective and can give the client a new script for which to go out into the world and experience different relationships. So in terms of expectancy with psychodynamic therapy, I think the biggest question is, does the client expect it to work? Like this cartoon says, with all therapies, the client has to be willing to play the game for it to be beneficial. So are clients willing to engage in this process in order for it to be of benefit? That is certainly the case with all of the therapies. And I think that this one in particular, if you think that a psychodynamic therapy is what you need, if you think that you need psychoanalysis, you're more likely to believe in the methods and believe in the rituals, and that likely will mean it has higher outcomes and better expectations. So just some things to keep in mind: that psychodynamic therapy is most useful for clients who are, first of all, interested in their own histories and culture. Second, are seeking insight and are what you would say psychologically minded. Third, are adults with relationship problems or parenting problems. Or fourth, adults who experience trauma as children. So this doesn't fit clients who necessarily want a quick resolution of symptoms, and some clients may not like the therapist's distance. This is not going to be fast symptom reduction. This is really healing old wounds, and that can take a lot of time. So it's just something to keep in mind as you're thinking about whether or not this theory would work for you or would work in your setting. So here are some further readings for those of you guys who are interested. Obviously, Ghost in the Nursery is one case study that we read. Here are some other books. And then some further reading on Carl Jung, who I think is pretty fascinating. Thank you.